Welcome to the briefing. Today we meet just days after the announcement of a ceasefire in Gaza, following 2 years of genocide, during which over 67,000 Palestinians have been killed, with estimates placing the number closer to 500,000 and thousands more injured. Joining me today is Randa Ghazy, who is an Italian Egyptian journalist, author, media specialist. She published her first book, Dreaming of Palestine, when she was just 15 years old, and it went on to be translated into 16 languages. Before becoming a freelance media expert, she worked for Save the Children. Today, Randa is a regular voice in European and international discussions on Palestine. Also joining us in the discussion today is Elian Weizman, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at London South Bank University. Her research and writing focuses on Israel and Palestine, as well as settler colonial regimes around the world, the dynamics of resistance within settler colonial states, the intersection of law and violence, and most recently on the criminalization of political activism. She's also written about the crackdown on Palestine solidarity movements in the UK after the 7th of October. So the ceasefire brought relief to many in Gaza. Many of us have seen the incredible footage of celebrations and ululations. But this also has come with reports that the Israeli army has nevertheless been firing at Palestinians in Gaza City. I wonder, Randa, if you can tell us what your feelings were upon the announcement of the ceasefire and what you make of it just days in.
Well, for sure, the first feeling was one of relief, because anything that can, stop the bombing, the massacres in Gaza is welcome. But obviously, looking at the actual so-called peace plan, which is the way it's been portrayed by international media, I find it really hard to call it a peace plan for a number of reasons. Firstly, it does essentially, it looks like a plan to start a new way of colonizing Palestine in many ways, because it doesn't really address the core issues behind what's happening in the region, which is mainly the illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. It doesn't actually address the issue of how to create a Palestinian state. It kind of alienates Palestinians. This board of peace idea is appalling. The idea that Palestinians should be ruled by a number of international leaders, someone like Tony Blair, who's called in our region the butcher of Baghdad. I mean, that's absolutely shocking. And then essentially, I don't think that plan actually addresses also some very difficult logistical questions. Say, for example, the withdrawal of the Israeli troops, which used to be a sticking point, a very important point for Hamas. The plan doesn't really address this in a way that is, that is actually realistic, because there's no talk of a final permanent withdrawal of the troops. It's just a gradual withdrawal, with Israel keeping essentially control over the borders, the Philadelphia corridor. And Smotrich, the minister Smotrich, has already said once we get the hostages back, we should just start again the war and destroy Hamas. So I think that the plan is completely one-sided, and this doesn't give him much confidence. And the fact that, as you pointed out, as the so-called ceasefire was being agreed, Israeli troops continued to, with the tanks, to shoot at Palestinians on Al Rashid Street. Last night, I believe, there was an attack on a residential building in Gaza City with at least 40 people under the rubble. We've heard of attacks in Khan Yunis. All of this doesn't fill me with much confidence that the Israelis are actually serious about stopping essentially the massacres in Gaza. I do want to be positive, though. I do want to be optimistic, and it was absolutely amazing seeing all those images of Palestinians celebrating. And I don't think they're celebrating because they love the plan. I just think that they're relieved that for now they have survived.
Yep. And do you feel that this is very much the cautious approach that global solidarity movements should also be adopting?
Absolutely. And I do think that in many ways, take, for example, the activists of the flotilla. What I found remarkable about that movement and that mission is that they're not just addressing the current genocide. I think what they did, I really give them credit for that, is they've again put the attention on the decades-long blockade of Gaza. It's true, things worsened after the 7th of October. We all know that on the 9th of October, Galan said no electricity or food or water will enter Gaza. But the truth is that Gaza has been under a naval, sea, air blockade since 2006. And this has caused a lot of, obviously, structural issues in Gaza and poverty. Before the 7th of October, I remember working on a report by Save the Children saying that essentially at least 2 children a day were unable to leave Gaza for medical reasons. They needed life-saving treatment.
So this was before the 7th of October?
This was before the 7th of October. So the blockade has actually, directly and indirectly killed so many Palestinians.
Yeah.
I interviewed a child who had some injuries due to an unexploded device that he picked up. And again, this is before the 7th of October. And this device exploded in his hand, and he essentially lost 3 fingers, but also his eyes could have been saved, but he needed to get urgent surgery and treatment outside Gaza. And the Israeli authorities just kept denying this permit for him and his parents. And so his father was crying as he was telling me that, we could have saved his eyes.
Yeah.
So this is what the blockade means on a daily basis for Palestinians. And I think that many of these activists are fully aware that things are just got worse after the 7th of October, but they were already very difficult. And we know that there have been so many humanitarian missions trying to break the siege, the blockade. So I do hope that this international solidarity movement advocates for, obviously, the end of the genocide, but not just the current genocide, also the incremental, the gradual genocide that has been going on, not just in Gaza, but in the occupied West Bank too.
And do you think, maybe Elian, you can come in on this, that the ceasefire may also provide the justification that many states in the West who've been partaking in some of the repression of Palestine solidarity efforts to effectively heighten that repression, because then they get to say, well, it's over. We're not gonna allow the mass protests. We're not gonna allow you to continue, with the direct actions, with the boycotts, with the, all the various forms of solidarity that we've seen being expressed over the past 2 years.
Maybe firstly, just to kind of connect to something that you said is the idea that indeed I think for the solidarity movement is to say that the struggle was now, the first urgent task was to stop the fast killing, the genocide in Gaza, but essentially this is a much bigger and much longer duration of incremental and slow killing of Palestinians since the beginning of the Zionist project, since 1948 at least. That is going through different phases with different levels of intensity, but it's ongoing. And yes, it reached a peak point, and the numbers and also like the brutality of all, and the fact that it was live streamed and we could all see it. But in terms of so the task is to keep on the pressure. It's like say, okay, we need to stop the immediate killing, but we also need to address the bigger picture and the bigger question of Palestine, in which this was
and the need for liberation,
and the need for liberation, which is in Gaza, in the West Bank, and also for Palestinians, like 48 Palestinians that are with Israeli citizenship, and addressing the question of refugees and all of these issues that are related to the question of Palestine, if you want to call it like that. But in terms of repression, I think there is not much excuses needed, because it's already ongoing in full intensity. I mean, I clearly can speak more confidently about what's happening in the UK with this, because what we are seeing is just an escalation of measures which are not new in themselves, and they didn't start with repression of activism around Palestine, but they were, it's on other forms of activism or targeting populations that were already targeted before. Of course, black and other people of color, racialized communities in the UK that are firstly targeted by that, but were already targeted before.
Yeah.
But also highly represented in this kind of protests. So I don't know if they needed excuses to increase the repression that is already quite high. And things are becoming normalized in a way, because it's what was really alarming some time ago. It's become normalized, and now it's just increasing and increasing. So yes, now we see pensioners being arrested, in kind of a Defend Our Juries protest, and also this will become normal. And I'm not sure there is a need for much kind of more justification.
The repression will continue business as usual in and of itself.
And can I add just on that? I do believe, maybe I'm giving the flotilla too much credit, but I have a feeling when I wonder, why did this peace plan, why did it come now? There were many other, in some ways, similar plans that had already been discussed on the table that Hamas had already accepted. I do believe that there's a number of reasons. Surely, as we all know, Donald Trump was quite keen to get this this peace Nobel Prize. But also, I believe that the pressure of this movement had started to somehow have an effect on some European leaders, certainly like Meloni in Italy. These nationwide strikes are in many ways unprecedented for what is considered by many a foreign issue. It's not a domestic issue.
They were considerable, as from the UK, watching the scenes in Italy of people taking to the streets in such
that was absolutely incredible.
Huge numbers. Yeah,
I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. It reminded me maybe of the protests when Iraq, was invaded. But yeah, that was a huge, just a huge show of support for Palestine, but also essentially expressing deep dissatisfaction with the lack of action by the Italian government and probably most European governments who, that approved essentially, I think, 18 different packages of sanctions against Russia and not a single one against Israel. And Donald Trump himself apparently told Netanyahu, Israel will be loved again. Like, he just signed this. You can't fight against the whole world. So in a way, I do hope that this movement has also played that role. It's put a lot of pressure, and it's now more convenient to at least be appearing as being ready for peace rather than continuing without clear objectives, just to kill Palestinians with no end in sight.
And do you feel that, particularly if we look at, the mobilization in Italy, but also we've seen Greece and Spain extending similar, waging in similar forms of solidarity, that we feel that there is like a tide turning. But do you think that necessarily will translate into policy, effectively, into shaping policy for the better when it comes to the Palestinian question?
That's a big question, and I'm not sure of the answer. Obviously, I want to be optimistic and say that yes, this will continue to put pressure on European leaders and kind of force them to take the action that they haven't taken in 2 years. On the other hand, if I try to be realistic, I know that this momentum, I don't know if this momentum is sustainable in the long term. And in a way, this so-called peace plan seems to be also, to essentially try to kill this momentum. And so, even if on the ground things are still very, on a humanitarian level, terrible for Palestinians, but essentially this is a way to neutralize the arguments of activists,
Yeah.
because there you go, you have a peace plan, and now everyone is everything. But we can't just forget about these 2 years, and in general the core issues in Palestine and Israel. So I think it's essential to keep putting pressure
Yeah.
on our leaders and try really to change the narrative and the framework. And it's now not just about the genocide. It's not about just withdrawing the troops, stopping bombing Gaza. It's about ending the illegal occupation. The ICJ has already said this is an illegal occupation. Israel must stop occupying the West Bank and Gaza. So this should be the objective of this solidarity movement now.
Because in many ways there is still that disconnect, which is why there's room for pessimism. Because in Italy, you see these incredible scenes that have arguably inspired, the rest of the world to want to mobilize similarly. But you also have the government that continues to be so complicit that politicians have been complained about to the ICC. So
I mean, they lied for months. And I think this is also one of the reasons that in Italy, the youth they're so frustrated, because essentially the Italian government kept saying that their position was that they weren't really sending weapons to Israel, and that's because they stopped new licenses. But actually, lots of different investigations revealed that they were still sending components of F-35 fighter jets and other materials that can be used for explosives, and the old licenses were still, so that essentially they were still sending arms to Israel. Not to mention the fact that Italy abstained from votes in favor of a ceasefire at the UN General Assembly. They voted against stopping the EU-Israel Association Agreement, so to stop also the trade deal with Israel. So there is such a disconnect there, and also during the Freedom Flotilla big media story, because it was a huge media story in Italy, I would say much more than here in the UK.
Because there was also many Italians on board.
40, I think at least 40 Italian activists on board of the flotilla, and the government just kept criminalizing the activists. The prime minister called them irresponsible. So there was also a defamation campaign against this mission. Then at some point even arguing that they were funded by Hamas. And that showed how desperate they were in a way, but also still willing to lie, because at some point the prime minister even said, why are they trying to bring aid when we could have done it in such a dangerous way, when we could easily do it in a safe way? And then that begs the question, then why haven't you done it? What about
then do it.
Then do it. What about the malnutrition rates soaring in Gaza? How is this happening?
Elian, why is Palestine solidarity so threatening to these governments that claim to be bastions of democracy and protectors of freedoms?
I mean, this is also a big question that, and I have to say that while I am, I've written about this, and I am writing about this still, about this process of criminalization, is also trying to understand exactly, so what is the threat here? Why this is seen as such a, which kind of interest is threatening, but I think here there is several answers that I can give, and there's some people much better placed to answer this than me, I have to say. Or speaking about material interests that are obviously involved in support of Israel, in which the US is heavily involved, and also many European countries, so to keep the settler colony ongoing and protecting interests that are at the end, it's about energy, if it's oil or gas, and the attempt to create these alliances with the Gulf states, and which started with the Abraham Accords, and the idea is to expand these. So for that, Israel is also a key country, and also all the arms industry. But I think there is something else also, which is why, in the sense that Palestine is a foreign issue, is a foreign policy issue, but it's a domestic issue, because if we look at the composition of the solidarity movement, it's also, we see alliances across different generations and different communities, people from different religions, different backgrounds that are coming together and starting to slowly or more recently, even more faster, to connect the dots between why Palestine is not only about Palestine, but it's about our life here also. And it happens that with increasing repression, actually more people understand that this is about also their lives here, and it's about their civil liberties in this so-called liberal democracy that we live in. And I think this is true probably for also other European states. So when you see suddenly that people, that are going to protest against genocide, which should be an obvious thing, are then being treated as a threat, then labeled as, here was like the hate marches, of course, the accusation of anti-Semitism, all of that, and which was also very, almost infuriating in how, after the attack on the synagogue in Manchester, when both the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister are speaking about we need to consider the feeling of the Jewish community, and we absolutely need to consider the feelings of the Jewish community. But how is that contradicts protest against the genocide in Gaza? So this kind of labeling this as if it's an anti-Jewish protest, I think it's clearly another attempt, of course, to demonize the protesters in the same way of calling them, of course, terrorists, Hamas supporters, and all of that. So yes, and that's the same, of course, with the use of counterterrorism legislation against direct action groups such as Palestine Action, which is it beggars belief that this is where we are at. Yeah. But at least I'm hopeful that the more repression we encounter, actually it makes more people wake up to the realities that we live here, and to connect the fact that the struggle against inequalities and against austerity and against all these draconian measures here, it's the same struggle for also the liberation of Palestine.
Yeah. There's very little room to it's very difficult for the state to justify the arrest of pensioners, of 80-plus-year-olds.
Simply holding a placard. But also what you were saying, Elian, made me think of how historically protests in favor of Palestine in the Arab world have always been seen as very dangerous, as worrying for Arab leaders, and they've always repressed them because they could sense that those could be catalyzers for bigger protests against oppression in those countries. And that's kind of like, I can see parallelism there. That's why I could relate to many of the things you were saying, just thinking, for example, as an Egyptian, apparently the Global Summit Flotilla should have also been joined by 4 Egyptian activists who have been detained. And even when the Summit March tried to reach the Rafah crossing, certainly the Egyptian government didn't facilitate that. But also if I think of the Gulf countries, you could say the same about Saudi Arabia and other countries where those leaders are really careful not to be perceived as being too close to Israel, although the Abraham Accords were actually going the opposite direction in many ways. But certainly rulers in the Arab world care a lot about, they do try to keep an eye on how their populations feel about everything that's happening in Palestine. And I think they are aware of this connection. And again, protesting for the freedom of Palestine is actually protesting for your own conscience, for your own values, against colonization, against oppression. It's not just about Palestine. And I think this is a very scary, it's just a very scary movement in many ways for many of this Western leaders. There are some people saying in Italy, for example, you're not protesting for, to increase salaries in Italy or for many of the problems we have in the country, and then you care about a foreign country. But it's not about that. It's about, this is what can be worse than a genocide happening during, live, and you're watching it on social media. So if you don't stand up against that, it means that you won't be able to stand up against any other form of oppression.
I wanted to ask you, Elian, actually, thinking about opposition and movements that have been speaking out against what has been happening in Gaza. I wanted to know more about your thoughts on opposition from within Israel. What, does it exist? What does it mean to the bigger picture and the question of the occupation more widely?
Yeah, I know that many people want to believe that there is an opposition in Israel, that, we just need to kind of reach out to them and
win
take
hearts
them.
and minds.
Yeah, but I don't know. I'm like the biggest pessimist on the Israeli society, and I can say that there is no opposition to the government. There is opposition to the government, to Netanyahu, definitely, that is not going on for the last 2 years, but it goes back to, I don't know, there's already during 2021, and then since January 23 with all the decision to create these judicial changes in Israel. But in essence, there is no opposition to the genocide as such. I cannot say. I can say that, it would be kind of a big statement to say that from wall to wall there is a support of the genocide, or at least not everybody will speak about this in the same way. So you will hear different kinds of discourses, of course. So all of the materials which used for the South African case, in the ICJ against Israel, with accusation of genocide, was statements of right-wing politicians and then soldiers and so on to prove intent and also inaction. But I'm actually interested to see what's happening on the other side. So not those that say, we need to erase Gaza very blatantly like this, but those that are using other terminology, but at the end they mean the exact same thing, or they are supporting what the army is doing there, in essence. So yes, so it's either those that will speak about, this is a land that should be for the Jews, and we should resettle, rebuild the settlements in Gaza, and either kill or get rid of the whole population in different ways, because it should be Jewish land, or those that will say that we just need to, make sure that the 7th of October will not happen again. So this kind of desire for security, but security that will be permanent, will be long-lasting. And I'm not just using this terminology, it's not mine, it's actually from Dirk Moses, that was speaking about permanent security as kind of the desire to reach the moment where it's kind of the end of the threat. But what does it mean to reach this moment, and how do you reach it? So yes, so there is, I'm saying the Israeli society is genocidal on all fronts. There were a lot of protests, and that were constant and ongoing. So I'm saying before the 7th of October and also after. So after, it was mainly led by the families of those that are held, the captives or the hostages in Gaza. But in essence, the demand was, we want to free the hostages, which fair enough. So that was the main concern. The concern was not Palestinian lives, or Palestinian liberation is out of the question.
Yes.
So,
of course.
Elian, do you think if the hostages hopefully will be returned soon, and then if the Israeli forces resume the genocide, would you expect then the Israeli society not to have any opinion on that, or to be supportive of that?
I did not see mass movement that was calling to stop the killing of Palestinians. Yes, I heard definitely more voices, but the arguments that they bring to this is the moral stain on Israel, or as those that are kind of coming out of the ashes of the Holocaust we are being accused in committing genocide, so we need to kind of distance ourselves from this. It doesn't look good. So seeing starving children, or
Not a good marketing strategy.
No. So it's a PR problem
Yeah,
more
it's a
than
PR
actually a problem
My
that
gosh.
like the killing that needs to stop. I don't know if people will kind of be enthusiastic about going back to because obviously the fighting of the army in Gaza is coming also with huge constraint on Israeli economy, and Israel started to they like to go abroad and have their fun. And recently it became increasingly an unpleasant experience for Israelis that were then, pushed away from places or not welcomed. Of course, this is always labeled as some anti-Semitic conspiracy rather than something that is very specific about calling to stop the genocide and the complicity of society, which I believe the whole society is complicit in that, whether they justify it in this way or another.
See, if I can jump in there as well, I think this is so interesting also because there's this myth in Europe in general, in the Western world, about Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East, which is something we hear so often, especially in Italy. And I do believe that that's false. That's not true for many reasons. The apartheid system, obviously, is one of them. But essentially, I think from my perspective, the real problem is Zionism. It's the ideology that from its very onset was based on ethnic cleansing. Would you agree with that? And would you then say that Zionism is the predominant, widely accepted ideology in the current state of Israel?
Well, absolutely. I think it's also very important that we center Zionism as the ideology and the practice that we are fighting against. And I think also the solidarity movement needs to center that, and to a great extent this is happening more and more. And it's important for multiple reasons also in order to separate this. It's not about being Jewish or not Jewish, it's about being Zionists. And that's important to remember. But I think, so yes, we need to center kind of the fight against this ideology that entails then the idea of Jewish supremacy on the land, or special privileges for Jewish people on this piece of land. That's the problem. The problem is not that there will be a Jewish presence at the end, but that people will live in inequality. The issue of democracy, it's interesting. Yes, I agree. It's not it cannot be called a democracy when we are speaking about almost equal number of people that are living under Israeli control without any rights at all. And the fact that there is 20% of the citizenry that also is like second or third or fourth class citizens, which are the Palestinian citizens. But I don't want to kind of throw this issue completely out of the discussion, because this is important in order to understand that people in Israel can voice opposition to their governments without being disappeared or being thrown in jail. So there is certain civil liberties and democratic protection for citizens in this country. So they can be in opposition and not being treated as will happen in completely, illiberal or non-democratic regimes. So that's actually make the things even worse. So it's not that if you will go out against the genocide in Israel, somebody will kidnap you in the middle of the night if you are Jewish Israeli.
But the minute they passed that law in 2018 saying that this is essentially the Jewish state, wouldn't that pose a big question around how democratic is a state that is?
No, without doubt. I mean, I think already before, the law just made it kind of, in the letter of the law, made it official. But so I'm saying just about this kind of idea that when people have the possibility to actually be more vocal in opposition, but they are not in opposition because they are in agreement. And I think the majority of the population is very openly saying that they are Zionists. And that's the problem, but people don't see it as a problem.
So it's almost like the democratic infrastructure is there, but it's not really being used.
I think there's a question of will. That there is no will to oppose Zionism if the considerable majority of that society defends and believes in Zionism.
So that's the thing, that at the end there is kind of overwhelming support in the idea that, this should be a Jewish state. And with it comes that Jews have certain kind of privileges that others do not have. And this is accepted as kind of, for some, a necessary evil, and for others, just, that's how it should be. And those that thinks that is a necessary evil will be the more on the liberal side. And I think it's always a discourse that I'm particularly interested in because it's more interesting and sometimes more difficult to argue with because it all sounds very reasonable. And, and it's, especially for European ears, this is what people want to hear a lot of time, no? So they can speak the language of security and also we all want to live in peace. But what does it mean, actually? I mean, if it means about giving up privileges, sharing the land, this is not what people really want to do. Even if some people will speak, I support two-state solution, but okay, what does it mean in practical terms? That remains to be seen.
And would you say then that liberal Zionism is almost more dangerous than?
Of course, I mean, it's a tricky question because, if we look at history, 1948 happened under kind of the historical labor Zionism, also 67. And now also, there was immediately, as after 7 October, there was a coalition government, so that kind of opened the counterattack, the genocide. But it's more, it's a discourse that is more difficult to handle because it speaks to reasonability, and it also falls on liberal European ears that want to hear this, and at the same time, this speaks the same language because I don't want to say that here liberalism is something fantastic. We know what liberalism
leads to.
It was born out of, I want to say, at the same time with colonial expansion, and so it's the same thing. And so that's why, but it's a force that is more difficult to reckon with and to argue with because it sounds good. So just to say that if we are looking for the left opposition in Israel, I would say that there is not really such a thing. Of course, I can always point to a group of committed anti-Zionist Jewish Israelis that exist and they struggle and they are standing in solidarity with Palestinians and doing what they can from inside. But in terms of a mass movement or of a substantial size that we should hope and reach our hand to, I do not see its existence within Israel.
And on that note, I wonder how you both feel in terms of what should be expected or actually needed from the international communities, from these movements that have been born out of, but also just been consistent in opposing the genocide, in mobilizing people in solidarity with the continued struggle for liberation for the Palestinian people. What now?
Well, I think it's important for these movements to also in many ways recognize their privilege in protesting and acknowledging the Palestinian experience and understanding the right to self-determination of Palestinians who should be free to choose the type of state and government that they do see fit. I think that they should continue to mobilize for, as mentioned earlier, the core issues that are behind what's happening today in Palestine, which is the occupation, the Zionist ideology. On top of that, it's very important for the international community to start being honest when they talk about the two-state solution, which is something that is still widely considered the ultimate solution for this decades-long issue. Where is the territory where the Palestinian state should be created? It's very sad, but the truth is that we are probably heading towards a one-state solution unless something really major happens where Israel agrees to completely dismantle all the illegal settlements and accept the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, which would be the right thing in terms of international law. But being realistic, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So at least then the international community and the UN, they should start a real conversation about the other alternative, which is the one-state solution. There are just no other realistic solutions, and start working towards that. I wished as a European, as an Arab European, that the EU starts finally playing a role. It has completely abdicated to its role on a diplomatic, from a diplomatic perspective, and that's one of the problems. We don't have real mediators. We have the US playing the role of the sponsor of Israel, the Arab states essentially just thinking about it in very pragmatic, business-led way. And so probably the EU should play a bigger role in mediating. So I do want to be optimistic, and I do want to hope that this genocide will force the international community to start working seriously towards a diplomatic solution.
Yeah.
So if I can speak kind of less on kind of governmental or leadership level, but more on, if we can call it the movement, is to keep on building the pressure, because this is the first step was to stop the genocide, to stop the fast killing, and now we also need to address all the other issues. First, we need to see that this is actually happening. I'm still kind of cautious here. So is to keep on the pressure to address the entirety of the question of Palestine, but also is about keeping on building alliances in this struggle that goes beyond Palestine. So Palestine is important in itself, but is also the symbol of other, also say like an anti-imperialist struggle that then impact our life also here. So it's a struggle for all our liberation at the end. From the different, in some countries, oppressive regimes, and in some countries, so-called non-oppressive regimes that nevertheless are doing it in other ways in our daily life. And I think this is what will continue scaring our leaders in the different places where we are. But if it scares them, and if they repress more and more, I think that this is also leading more and more people to wake up and understand that this is a struggle for their own lives also. So this needs to keep on happening.
Thank you both so much. It was an incredibly insightful discussion. And we hope that things will only continue to progress on a positive front, and that this ceasefire is lasting. And until then, we'll continue. Thank you.
Thank you.